thank you all so much for coming. My name is Sean Posey. I am the author of Lost Youngstown, and just so you all know, I have books here with me. If any of you would like to stay afterwards and buy a book, they are just $20 each. I will also be welcome to sign any books that you like, and we're going to hopefully save some time here at the end for some questions, but if you have further questions, I'll be glad to stay behind and talk to anybody who wants to stay and talk. So welcome. I was born here in Youngstown, I should say, not here, in Youngstown. When I was about 6 or 7 years old, my parents left, and I ended up growing up in the Akron-Canton area, mostly. But my father would always tell me stories of Youngstown when I was growing up, about what things were like, what the steel mills were like, what it was like driving down across the Center Street Bridge at night and seeing the sky light up, almost this kind of vision that in my mind seemed like something maybe out of hell almost, with the night on fire and smoke and all these stories that he would tell me about. And occasionally I would listen to him and think, you know what, Dad's embellishing. I mean, some of this stuff sounds made up. And then in later years I would realize that it was actually not made up. But it got me really interested in the place that I had lived, but I really had no memory of Youngstown. Every year we would drive into Boardman to see my grandmother. And we would go from Canton to Boardman, get out of the car, go to grandmother's house, get back in the car, and drive back to Canton. One year, we went into Boardman, and my father said, I'm going to put you in the car, we're going to go to Youngstown, and I'm going to show you the city that you were born in that you don't really know anything about. This would have been during the 1990s. And we drove down Wilson Avenue through the east side of Youngstown into Camel, and at that time the rusting hulks of the old steel mills were still there, and the shuttered businesses and the old mill bars and everything, and I couldn't really get over it. I had never seen anything like it. I had never seen anything like these huge industrial structures that, to me, people of my generation, it was hard to believe that people actually worked in these places. And we stopped and we got out. My dad took me into this old building. There were worker gloves still on the floor, and he said, this is where I worked when I was going to Youngstown College in the early 1960s. And he made so much money that he didn't have to work the rest of the year. He could just go to school. He could just pay his way right through school and work a summer in the mill. So all that stayed with me. Went back to Canton. I graduated from high school. I ended up going into college out west, but I came back here about 6.5 years ago, and I started doing research. I started going around and photographing all these old places in Youngstown, the mills, all these old businesses, neighborhoods, everything, and going through and trying to figure out, okay, what were the history of the places? Who were the people who lived here? Who were the people who worked in the steel mill? Who were the people that went to this old movie theater downtown? And this was all something I had done on the side, and I wrote a few articles about Youngstown, and I got a call from the History Press publisher, and they said, hey, how would you like to write a book for our Lost series? There's a Lost Chicago and a Cleveland and a New York. And I said, well, I'd love to. What do you what do you want me to write about? And they said, well, write whatever you want to write. Just make a Lost Youngstown. So I sat down and I thought, what have other people written about this area from a historical standpoint? And a lot of it I found out was centered around the steel industry almost entirely, or around specific ethnic groups like Slovaks or the Irish or the Mahoning Valley or the Italians of the Mahoning Valley. So I decided to maybe do an urban history, something that would be applicable to everyone, no matter what your ethnic background or nationality was, or whether you worked in a steel mill or not, or whether you ever knew any members of the mob or anything like that. So this book, I think, is a pretty interesting take on the urban history of Youngstown. Now, I could have written 10 or 15 volumes if I had the time or the years and the money to do it. But what I wanted to do was break down the history of the area into 3 different sections: industry, third places, and what I called communities of the past. So obviously industry built this entire area, not just Youngstown, but obviously Girard, Niles, all the places around it. This is the reason why we're here today. The first chapter I wrote was on Youngstown Sheet and Tube. there were a lot of steel companies that were in this area, including U.S. Steel, which was the largest steel company of them all by far. But Youngstown Sheet and Tube bore the Youngstown name. And years after all the steel mills were owned by people from outside the area, Republic Steel originally started in the area, eventually it moved to Cleveland, Youngstown Sheet and Tube was still run by local boys. So I thought that was important to talk about. And when it was finally taken over by the Lykes Corporation in 1969, it was one of the very last mill in the area that was run by people who were not from outside the community. And of course, we all know what happened after Lykes took over Youngstown. Within less than a decade, Sheet and Tube was gone, both in Camel and over here in Briar Hill. The second part of the book I wrote was on something called third places. Third places is a term that urban planners use for a place that is not your home and a place that is not where you work. So think about bars or dance halls or movie theaters. I have a chapter on here, the Paramount Theater, downtown Youngstown. The Paramount was the last downtown theater to still be operating, and it was the last downtown theater to be torn down. Just 2013, the Paramount Theater had been sitting there empty for years, was finally brought down. But when it was built in 1918, it was the first of the downtown movie palaces. Some of you might recall there were lots of theaters in Youngstown and even in the downtown, but there were four big ones: the Paramount, the State, the Palace Theater, and of course the Warner Theater, which is still there. Now it's called Powers Auditorium, but it still goes back to the original Warner Theater. So I wanted to use the Paramount as an example of the kind of theaters that existed 50, 60, 70 years ago. Today you go to the movies and all the theaters typically are corporate owned. They all pretty much look the same. Sometimes they have a little bit of faux Art Deco architecture that tries to make you think that you're going back to the 30s or whatever, but it doesn't work very well. And you get inside the theater and it's a box and there's chairs and there's the screen, and the same Regal Theater here in Boardman, Ohio is the same Regal Theater in California, and so on and so forth. But the old movie theaters of the past really were palaces. They had an ornate decoration, classical architecture. Many of them could sit from 1,000 people to almost 3,000 people. Balconies. Going to the movies, as many of you know, back then was really an experience. People got dressed up to go downtown. People got dressed up to go to the movies. It was a big deal. Taking a date to the movies was a big deal. People nowadays, especially young kids nowadays that are growing up maybe without even spending a lot of time at a movie theater at all, instead watching whatever it is that comes up on their phone or on YouTube, to them, and I've had this experience with my students, this is all a totally foreign concept. Like, what do you mean? People wore suits to go to the movies? What are you talking about? Going to the movies was a big deal? I can see a movie whenever I want to, you know. So I wanted to tell the story of the local movie theaters through the example of this one theater, the Paramount. But I talk about a lot of the different theaters that existed around here, and in particular I talk about somebody who was important to this area, to Girard, a guy by the name of Peter Wellman. That name may or may not mean something to you. Peter Wellman actually at one time by far owned the most movie theaters in the Mahoning Valley area, something like 14 or 15 theaters, and even ran theaters outside of the area too. The two theaters that used to be in downtown Girard, the Newmock Theater and the Wellman Theater, which of course was named after Wellman himself, those were his mainstay theaters. Wellman was a Girard guy, but he pretty much was the biggest name in movies here in the Mahoning Valley, and he was a local guy. So right up until the end of his life in 1969, Wellman was a representative of what old-time theater guys used to be like. They were guys who ran theaters, worked in their own theaters, lived in the local area, and did things like take people's tickets when they come in, greet people by their name. They knew who people were. They were people who gave back to the community. All of that has changed today. All movie theaters typically are corporate owned. We'll never see the people who own them. They don't have any connection to the area. But Peter Wellman was a really interesting guy, and I put this in here because he was I think, very much representative of what a lot of Youngstown businessmen were like at one time. They might have ran powerful empires or mini empires, but they were very rooted locally. And that went all the way up to the CEOs of Youngstown Sheet and Tube. Way after the steel business began to migrate out towards Chicago and to the west, the guys who ran Sheet and Tube understood that the steel business was moving west and there was nothing they could do about it. But Youngstown Sheet and Tube, which had even more profitable mills in the Chicago area, the executives wanted to keep it here in Youngstown because they thought that was important. Corporate headquarters should remain here in Youngstown. We're still a Youngstown company. We still have the Youngstown name. There was still a loyalty from these guys, many of whom had come up through the mailroom or as janitors, or guys who actually worked in the mills themselves and then became the CEO of a company. Talk about something that doesn't happen anymore today. Peter Wellman was kind of the same way when it came to movie theaters. The last section in the book is called Communities of the Past. And what I did was I wanted to talk about neighborhoods that are basically gone and see if I could reconstruct their histories. And one of those was Smoky Hollow neighborhood, and some of you might know that name, which was right next door to what is now Youngstown State University. And the other one is I wanted to talk about an area that is very close to where we're at now, the old stretch of West Federal Street that went from downtown Youngstown all the way down from Briar Hill, the Youngstown Sheet and Tube Briar Hill Works, here into Girard. So a lot of you know now, you go to West Federal Street in downtown Youngstown and you take it out of town past Fifth Avenue, you eventually run into Martin Luther King or 422. But years ago, that was all West Federal Street. And there were businesses and nightclubs and neighborhoods all up and down that stretch of West Federal Street, way out to where the Briar Hill Works were, which is now Valoric Steel. So I wanted to recreate what that was like at one time, because you can drive down that stretch today and you would never know that any of that had once been there. But there were all kinds of things of not only local importance, but national importance that had happened in that area. For example, some of you might know the name Westlake Terrace, the Westlake Terrace housing project, which was torn down just a couple of years ago. It's now called Arlington Heights. It's been rebuilt over on Martin Luther King. My father's family came here in 1940 when he was 1 year old from Pittsburgh trying to get into Westlake Terrace. At that time, public housing was considered a good thing. People wanted to be in public housing. They came here trying to get into the lottery system to get into Westlake Terrace. They couldn't do it, and they ended up having to not even be able to live in Youngstown because there was such a severe shortage of housing that there was no place for them to live in Youngstown. Try to picture that today. That's how many people were trying to get in the area. Of course, this was at the very end of the Depression. When Westlake Terrace was built at the end of the 1930s, it was the first public housing project in the United States built according to the U.S. Housing Act of 1937. The government decided there's a severe housing crisis in American cities, especially industrial cities. We're going to step in and we're going to give money to help localities build public housing. This was the first in the nation. Eleanor Roosevelt came here, cut the ribbon, gave a speech saying, "This housing project represents the New Deal. My husband's economic dream, his plan for the United States is represented here today in the New Deal." Michael Kirwan, who was the representative here at the time, gave a speech saying, once again, the Youngstown area is leading the nation. And back then, that was not out of the ordinary for a politician to say. In 1930, Youngstown was the 45th largest city in the United States. And even into the 1950s, it stood in the center of, and Girard as well, in the center of one of the largest steel producing districts in the entire world. During their most ambitious dreams, the Nazis, who at one time had hoped to invade the United States, had places like Akron and Youngstown, Ohio on their list of cities that had to be bombed. Because, just like in Western Germany, Youngstown was called America's Ruhr Valley, America's steel producing center. And when you combined it with nearby Pittsburgh, you had basically the industrial heartland of the entire world for decades on end. But Westlake Terrace, West Federal Street, the steel mills, the movie theaters, all of these places are not just places that if you get this book, places that you might have been to, or places that maybe your parents or grandparents might have told you about, or places that you have fond memories of, but also in this book is a lot of national history. I tried to combine local history and national history. Because what I found out when I first started studying the history of this area was, for an area of this size, never really a terribly large metropolitan area like Chicago or New York or something like that, this area had played an outside, and continues to play today, an outsized role in American history. So even today, long after the steel mills are gone, I get calls from South Korean news, or Dutch public television, or the Guardian newspaper saying, hey, we're coming into town because we want to know what the people in Youngstown are going to do in the 2016 election, and we want you to tell us about the history of the area. So even today, there are people coming from all around the world to Youngstown to try to figure out what is going on here in relation to the 2016 election, because this area is still representative of things that are happening at the national level in the United States. And our history is very much representative of national history. So if you want to tell a story about industrialization in the United States, or the steel and iron industry, or the history of immigrants in the United States, or the history of unionization, or the history of organized crime, I figured I'd mention that last. You can tell a story from this area that will perfectly capture the national mood and trends that happen nationally here, right here in this area. So Youngstown is a very unique area for some place of its size. We've played a large role in American history, and I think when you read this book, there's a lot of things in here that are things that we've lost in our history, things that are no longer there. And a lot of the time we talk about Youngstown, people talk about loss. Well, this is what we have, we don't have it anymore. You look at all the terrible things that have happened in recent history. But I also want people to read this and think, I have a justified pride in being from this area and being attached to the history of this area. For all the bad things that have happened here too, there are many good things that are happened here. And people have called me, written me letters, sent me emails. People who haven't lived in some of these neighborhoods or in the city for maybe 50 years telling me about how, you know what, I grew up in Girard, I grew up in Briar Hill, I grew up on the east side of Youngstown, and it made me who I am today. And I'm still attached to the area, even if I haven't been back there in decades. And there's not a lot of places, I think, that have expats like that. A lot of places like that that have shaped people in the way that people have been shaped who have grown up in this area. People whose fathers worked in the mills. People whose fathers worked at Ohio Leather or General Fireproofing. People who worked with their hands, and a lot of this history is a history of people who came over from other countries knowing nothing about where they were coming from, nothing about the language, and who survived and who prospered and who we represent today. So I wanted to wrap all that history in this book, and of course, once as I mentioned at the beginning, that's like 10, 12 volumes. But hopefully when you read this, you'll get a small sense of what the history was like here. I'm also working right now on a second book. It'll be coming out in May, about the theater culture of the Mahoning Valley, the theater history of the Mahoning Valley. So not just Youngstown, but every place in the valley, including Girard itself. And the information that I have in here about the Girard movie theaters, Peter Wellman, who I mentioned earlier, I'm going to expand on that in a big way and talk about, once again, the Mahoning Valley's role in the history of film. And of course, as we all know, or we should know, the Warner Brothers came originally from the Youngstown area. So the Warner Brothers, who went on to form the most powerful studio in the world at the time, Warner Brothers Inc., grew up mostly in the Youngstown area. And the very first films that they showed, very, very primitive films to people basically in a room like we're in here now, projecting on the wall, were in Niles, in Girard, in Youngstown, in Warren, and in Western Pennsylvania before they started their very first theater that they opened in Newcastle, Pennsylvania. So once again, if you wanted to talk about the history of films and motion pictures in the United States, you could tell a Youngstown story and find a way to represent what happened nationally as well. So hopefully they'll have me back and I'll talk more about that. So look for that book in May of 2017. And just in closing, I wanted to say that the history of this area is going to continue to be important in the years to come. Even after the election's over, 4 years from now, more politicians will be back here. And I think it's important for us, if we can, to preserve as much history on our own as we can. So if you are of a certain age, if you've lived through some of these things, take some time, maybe sometime, to write down your own history, or to do an oral history with a relative and record it. Very easy to do today, and leave it behind. Because what I found in this book was that a lot of places that I wanted to reconstruct the history of neighborhoods or businesses, I couldn't because too much history had been lost. The people who could tell me about it weren't around anymore. So while you still have a chance to do it, I would encourage you to do that on your own. Preserve as much local history as you can, any way as you can, or simply tell it to your children or grandchildren. They might not appreciate it now, but chances are, in years later, they will appreciate it. I only wish that I could go back and ask my grandmother what it had been like to go to the first Nickelodeons in the city, which of course she told me about and I didn't care about at the time or didn't think anything of it, just thought she was rambling. Now I wish that I could go back and get those stories. I have a chapter in here about the Elms Ballroom, which was one of the biggest ballrooms in northeastern Ohio. Both of my grandparents met there. I never got to talk to them about it. They're both gone now. So I would encourage you all, in whatever way you can, to think about how you can contribute to local history, and in doing so, contribute to basically the story of America. And I know that the Girard Library and the Mahoning Valley Historical Society and other places are trying to do that, so there's lots of outlets for you to do so. And I would encourage you to do that. I'd like to save some time for questions. So if anybody has any questions, please feel free to ask. Anybody at all, don't be shy now. Yes, ma'am.
What do you teach?
I've taught government, what they call political science. I've taught English. I've taught history. I've taught at Eastern Gateway Community College. I've also taught at the Catholic schools here too, Mooney and John F. Kennedy in Warren. So yeah, and whenever I've taught history, and we've got into certain chapters, especially 19th and 20th century history, I've always tried to bring in an anecdote or a story or something from the local area to kind of bring the students in, which of course is difficult, but I've found right away that there's so many ways for me to do it because, as I mentioned earlier, this area is so representative of so many national trends in especially in 19th and 20th century history. So yeah, I've tried to, first history class I taught, I showed my students a film from 1944 that was made by the War Board. It's called Steel Town. I don't know if you've ever seen this. It's actually on YouTube. You can Google it. And it's like a interesting, like 20-30 minute video about steel workers and their lives inside and outside the mills in the area. I showed it to my students, and a lot of them said, you know what, I just can't believe it. I didn't even know that we had steel companies here. I didn't know that any of this was here. Somehow this escaped them. Somehow somebody, their parents or whomever, neglected to even tell them about that. It blew them away. It really blew them away. And so every time I've taught a class, I've tried to throw in something like that to grab their attention, to try to explain to them history isn't just the story of great men or wars or battles or things that have taken place far away, but it's also a story that your grandparents are part of, or things that have happened here miles away from where you grew up. Yes, sir.
John, can you talk a little bit about something we've discussed before, and that's how the interstate system, the highway system, split up the community so badly,
right,
and destroyed the neighborhoods in Youngstown.
Yeah, you know, I thought about that when I was driving down here, because I came down 680 down through Martin Luther King down through here down to what used to be West Federal Street. And the first thing that came to my mind was I'm driving through what used to be somebody's backyard, which used to be somebody's house. And for somebody like me that doesn't remember a time when the expressway wasn't there, it's hard to picture. But yeah, when communities around here decided that there's a lot of congestion because right around the 40s or 50s, all of a sudden people started driving cars. They started using mass transit less. There was a lot of congestion on the roads, and they thought, well, we need to build arterial expressways. And of course, the idea came from Dwight Eisenhower, who was a commander in World War II, had gone to Nazi Germany and had saw the Autobahn system and how well it worked, and thought, well, we can duplicate it here in the United States. Of course, the German Autobahn system did not run through cities. Here, unfortunately, we built these arterial expressway systems and we drove them through cities, and of course we destroyed all kinds of historical neighborhoods. We destroyed people's churches, places like St. Anne's Church, which was down on West Federal Street, which was a huge place where people from Catholics from Girard and all around the area went. That was destroyed. Movie theaters were destroyed. Of course, people's houses were destroyed, and thousands of people were displaced. And it had a big impact on the city. It split up neighborhoods. It ended people's business. There was a lot of small business owners that were like, okay, there's an expressway going through where your business is. We're going to give you some money for it. You're going to have to relocate. But they found out they didn't have any place to relocate to, maybe. And that was the end. A lot of people were forced to leave some of the cities and go to the suburbs, even though they didn't want to, because their neighborhoods were destroyed by this. At the time, unfortunately, urban planners didn't think anything of it. They thought, well, this is progress, and somebody's going to have to suffer for progress, right? You got to break some eggs to make an omelet. But in retrospect, we hopefully would have done things a lot differently. So yeah, that had a big impact on Youngstown and a lot of surrounding areas. And years before the steel mills, people were leaving the city because of the expressways. Not only did it wipe out neighborhoods, but it made it easier for people to actually leave the city and go out to the suburbs. Yes, sir.
As a military person, in defense of Eisenhower, don't you think that he wanted to put the East Coast to the West Coast? They were called National Defense Highways, because he knew if we were under attack in the West, we had to get forces over in that area, and so they were called National Defense Highways. Right. When they first started.
Yeah, I wouldn't, don't get me wrong, I wouldn't blame Eisenhower for it.
Well, I didn't say you
yeah. Yes, you're right. That was the idea. That was the idea, was that in case we were ever at war with the Soviet Union, that actually having these highways connecting the nation would make it easier for U.S. military troops and munitions to be moved around. After it happened in the 60s, Eisenhower claimed that it had never been his ideas to ram expressways through cities and displace people. In his mind, it was just going to connect places, but not actually run through places where people lived. So we would have a highway system that would connect one city through another through rural areas, but not through actual people's neighborhoods. So I wouldn't really blame it on him. I think there's a lot of people it could be blamed on. But yeah, I think the idea was sound, and what the Germans did with the Autobahn was actually a good idea. So yeah, I think what Eisenhower had in his mind was probably probably not a bad concept.
Did you dig up any history on Oaks up the road?
It's interesting that you mentioned that, because yeah, I have a little bit about Avon Oaks in the next book that I'm writing. So if any of you might know the name Avon Oaks, or the Avon Oaks Ballroom, which is still over there and has been there for years. But about 115 years ago or so, Avon Oaks was kind of like the Idora Park of this area. It was an early amusement place where people would go to dance, to have picnics. They had a little miniature railway system that people could ride around in. They even had some amusement rides. Avon Oaks was kind of a big deal around the time where a lot of urban centers had their own little amusement areas. So Idora Park started right around the end of the 19th century, and the same thing happened with Avon Oaks. But yeah, I don't know a tremendous amount about it, but I did find a very detailed history of the park that a gentleman had done using archival research and had put on the internet. I can't remember his name, but if you Google I'm sorry?
Frank Basic.
Okay, well there you go. Yeah, if you go on there and Google it, there's a very good history of the Avon Oaks right on the internet. But yeah, it was apparently a very big deal around here. You know, right around the turn of the 20th century. And one of the gentlemen who ran a very popular series of concessions at Avon Oaks, a guy by the name of Jake Mock, he was the individual that started the Mock Theater over downtown, which later became the New Mock Theater under Peter Wellman. So that's a little bit of that theater history goes back to the Avon Oaks too. Anyone else? Yes, sir.
Yeah, I bought your book.
Oh,
I
yeah.
lived in North Carolina, we lived down
Oh, yeah.
for a year. And I read that book, and I grew up in the 60s in Youngstown, in Briar Hill, actually. And when you read the book, and if you grew up in the area, and all the things you said, I've been a part of most all of it, it was just like deja vu. It was a great book. I'd highly recommend people to read that book.
Thank you. Yeah, and I was lucky enough to speak to some people from the Briar Hill area that remembered the 40s and 50s and remember what it was like before urban renewal and the widening of streets and all that type of thing. And there was a lot of useful information about that. And I actually found some pictures of Briar Hill too, which are very hard to come by, as I found out.
Yes. I went to St. Anne's. I was in the last class at St. Anne's School, and I can remember the nuns saying about the big highway, which is the expressway behind us, because it wasn't built yet. And that's when they tore everything down.
Right.
The big highway.
Right. So when you go down there now, can you still picture in your head where it was? And
Left over there, it was back in those days. It's fallen apart. It's on the old Federal Street. It was the ice house.
oh, I have seen that. It's over by the bus garage somewhere, right? Yeah.
Exactly.
Right, yeah, and that's probably one of the very few, maybe the only building left from that area. That's very interesting. Yeah, I've been by that before, but it didn't ever click in my head that that's obviously what it dates back to. Right. Nice. Anyone else?
When the expressway came, is that when the streetcars left, or did they leave earlier?
The streetcars left pretty early. I don't know what happened around here, but by the 1940s, really, they were taking the old trolley cars out and putting in the electric buses. So for a while, they had buses that were attached to lines, and then eventually those went, and they just became diesel buses. So that was kind of the transition. Okay, so there was still some left then by that time.
In Girard, did they have it?
In Girard?
No, Youngstown.
We had a little bus company in Girard.
Yeah, and there's fortunately there's a lot of good pictures of those out there too. But yeah, I mean, it was very much at least the early ones looked very much kind of like the cable cars that they still have in places like San Francisco, where people would ride in and then we'd get out at a certain point and have to turn them around and go back the other direction. But
I wonder if they ever thought about getting those back.
I certainly, I mean, I certainly wouldn't mind. There are some cities that have done that have. Especially on the West Coast, and I think it's great, and it certainly lends a little bit more glamour, I think, maybe to public transportation than what it has now. Anyone else?
In the 1940s, when there was no housing to be had, do you know what the population was in Youngstown at that time?
In the city, it was around 170,000 people. At that time, some people say that during the Depression there was maybe more, maybe like 175,000, but we don't really know. There was a lot of course, as you know, during the Depression there was a lot of people moving around looking for work. In downtown Youngstown, they set up basically little facilities just to house men that were just sleeping on the streets. It was in Youngstown, it was really a terrible experience. The Atlantic Monthly magazine, national news magazine, did a story on the Depression calling Youngstown the hungry city, because there might have been something like 80% real unemployment. And a lot of people survived the Depressions just on things they grew out of their backyards. And coal that was given to them either by the steel companies or through barter. It was obviously a terrible experience. And I know my grandparents never stopped talking about the Depression. It left a lifelong impact on them until the very end.
I think the last time I checked, it was like 67,000 in Youngstown.
I think, that there might be 66,000 people there now. So at one time, just the south side of Youngstown, there was probably 70,000 people just in the south side of Youngstown. So the south side of Youngstown, say in 1930, had more people than the entire city has today. Yeah. And I don't know what the historical height of the population was in Girard, but I know Girard has lost far less people than Youngstown has, and I think than even Warren as well.
One place that I didn't really know about when I was growing up in Youngstown, I never really knew there had been a brewery, the Renner Brewery. And then I found out later, I'm all grown up, and I'm not sure, where was that? Was it over by Southside Hospital? Did the
Yes.
lady destroy the spot?
No, well,
I'd love to see where that was.
there are remains of it left. There's like one building, I believe, left. And if you go over the Market Street Bridge, maybe in a month when all the leaves are off the trees, going to the south side of Youngstown, and you look over across the river, you'll see the building that's still down there. And there was a road that used to be able to go back to it that they have entirely shut off there now, but there is still a part of the building down there. I think in the 1970s there was a fire that burned maybe the last of the facilities that were there, but there's still at least one building of the old Renner Brewery down there by the river.
You mentioned these places like the theaters, et cetera. Do you address or do you raise the issues regarding the wonderful railroad stations we used to have?
Oh, I do talk about it, though not at depth, but yeah, though obviously, yes. And at one time, going back into the 50s, but also the 40s, Youngstown used to get a lot of big road shows. So Broadway shows that were on the road with big sets, those would all come in on the railroads, and they would offload them and bring them in, and then they would have a show at, say, the Park Theater on the east side of Youngstown. Before it was the Burlesque Theater. Or the Palace Theater downtown, which the Palace Theater had an equity stage, and they had some big Broadway shows that were touring on the Palace Theater stage with the biggest stars in the country, and as well, of course, as all the big band acts. Tommy Dorsey, Glenn Miller played Yankee Lake. He played the Palace Theater downtown. Yeah, Frank Sinatra, when he was still with the Tommy Dorsey Orchestra in 1942, played the Palace Theater downtown. In fact, he played Youngstown several times. So yeah, it was, yeah.
The railroads had a major impact.
Oh yeah. Yeah, and there were multiple, and now it's if you see old pictures, it's very difficult to even figure out what the area looked like when there were all those railroads went through there, because the landscape is so just totally different now. There's hardly any, there's hardly any remnants left. But yeah, that was the first thing that struck me when I saw old pictures of the area around downtown, where all the railroad tracks and all the rail cars and everything. That was, immediately I was trying to put it together in my head, like, okay, what am I looking at here? Where was this picture at? Because the environment has just changed so much. Yes, sir.
Do you attribute any of this to NAFTA and GATT? Because we not only lost the steel mills, we lost 5 rubber companies in Akron, the pottery in East Liverpool. We lost 5 railroads that used to come. You want to catch a train out of Youngstown, you got to hump a freight. I mean, there's nothing on Youngstown.
Right.
And I taught on the south side of Youngstown. We used to take our football players at the end of the season, go down and get the Pennsylvania Railroad, run up to Cleveland and see a football game, and let them see Jim Brown and Ernie Green play, in the whole thing. And when you say we talk about loss, I think a lot of people as old as I am figure, there's a lot of things that are good about this country. They're great about this country. I served this country. My point is, there's quite a bit that we lost in this area.
Now I wouldn't say I know as much about what you're talking about, like say with NAFTA or something that happened in the 90s, but I do know that there's good evidence that there were places in Warren and some places in the Youngstown area that did relocate to Mexico, probably because of NAFTA. And of course, when Jim Trafficant was still the representative in this area, he was probably the first politician with kind of a national stage who really railed against NAFTA and against the Democratic Party, which he was a member of, and he said, well, we're going to come to regret NAFTA, and then many years later, just recently, Donald Trump picked up on things that traffic had been saying, 20 years earlier. Not to get too deep into modern politics.
Do you know why traffic was so hallowed in this area?
Well, I would, a few reasons. I would say maybe the main reason was the fact that when he was the Mahoning County Sheriff and he was ordered to put steel workers out of their homes and he refused to do it and went to jail. Yeah, and I think that, I think that definitely helped make his reputation right. Yeah, that's, and he, at the time, to give him some credit, regardless of what you think of him, he said, we're gonna see what is happening in this area happen all across the country. Working people are not just suffering here. This is something that's going to be national. And of course, he was right about it. And in many ways, he kind of prefigured the stuff that Trump and other people have talked about in more recent years. So yeah.
How do you think the digital age is going to affect people being able to do research like you're doing now, 20 years or 30 years from now?
That's a great question. It's the digital age is terribly helpful for research, but one thing I found out was it's not helpful unless somebody scans something and then puts it on the internet. So a lot of the research I did, most of the research I did from this book, maybe 90% of it came from library research or interviews I did with people or some dusty old archive I went into, and not the internet, just because I found out that a lot of the stuff is just not, no one's put it on the internet, it's just not there.
I do some local research, some local historical research, and you have to go to the libraries. I totally.
Yeah, that's one of the first things you find. You're like, wait a second, an old city directory would be a more help to me right now than Google is. Just because, if the information's, not on the internet, what are you going to do? It's not there. So so that's, I don't really know if that'll change in years to come, because I know a lot of archives are trying to put more and more things on the internet, but I don't know. I think it'll be a pretty slow process.
In your research for Lost Youngstown and for your upcoming book, were there any topics or places that you wanted to cover, but information was so elusive that you had to leave it out?
There were some, just nothing major. There were some old clubs and places that I wanted to touch on that there weren't a lot of information for. Another thing is, there's a lot of photographs in this book, photographs that I've taken of places that are abandoned. And then I have photographs of them, what they looked like when they were occupied, like businesses or mills or whatever. But they wanted me to use historical photographs too. So what I realized, it was also very difficult to find historical photographs, much more difficult than I thought it was going to be. So right away I was like, oh my God, what if I can't find enough photos of any of these places? What do I do then? They wanted me to use so many photos. Fortunately, I did find enough, and there were a lot of private owners that donated images for me to use in here, which was really helpful. But even then, I talked to some people who, were like, my family owned this business for 4 generations, and you know what? We don't have one damn photograph of it. Yeah, but I found out that was not uncommon either. Yeah, so like resources for local history, there's a lot of there's not a lot of photographic images out there. One thing I was lucky in this book was I discovered that the city of Youngstown, before they tore a lot of these areas out in urban renewal or when they built the highway, the city planners went around and photographed them. And some kind soul donated those photographs, those negatives, to the Historical Society. So if you were ever interested and you're going to go to the Mahoning Valley Historical Society, just ask them to show you the planning collection, and they have all these images from all the different sides of the city of places that are long gone that they photographed before actual construction began on them. And so yeah, I have a lot of those in here, including some from Briar Hill. But without that, there probably wouldn't have been any photographs. You got to figure a lot of these people who lived in these areas, nobody had phones back then where we could just take a picture in 2 seconds. A lot of them were working people who maybe couldn't afford a camera or didn't have the time to indulge in such hobby, or people just didn't think, what, this neighborhood or what's down the street, it's here today, it's going to be here in 100 years. People, we don't think that things are going to change as rapidly as they do, and then, no one photographs it, and then in 40, 50 years, we don't know what it looked like anymore, except for the people who were there and are still alive to remember it.
What time frame is covered in your book? I mean, when
Oh,
did you start in?
You know, from the 19th century, right around the time that the very first iron furnaces were built, here are the very first primitive charcoal iron furnaces, right up until the 1980s. So, you know, a lot of it is very heavily concentrated, say, in the 1940s and 50s and 60s and 70s, but I have, you know, a pretty wide swath of history in there, too. I tried to make it as wide as I could.
Do you have anything on the park over in Youngstown? The Rose Garden and that?
Oh, Mill Creek Park. You know, only a little bit. And the reason I didn't was when I started and I was looking at all the books that had been written previously, the first thing I did is I thought, okay, what subject matters have people already nailed so hard that I shouldn't even touch? And I found out there was a lot of really good books out there about Mill Creek Park, and I thought, you know what? I mean, first of all, it's not really lost. I mean, parts of it are. Parts of it are. And people have already done it much better. I don't have anything to contribute to it. A lot of people said, oh, well, you should put in a chapter about Idora Park. And I said, you know what, there was a guy that did, Rick Shale, that did a really good book on Idora Park, and he nailed it, and I don't think I have anything to contribute to that. So I tried to focus on things that people hadn't written about at all. So there's a lot about the Idora Ballroom. I couldn't find anything about the Elms Ballroom, so I put that in there. I wanted to also touch on things that I hadn't thought that people had written about. And of course, a lot of historians do that when you take an approach to history. You say, okay, what have other authors not done? What can I do differently that might shed some more light on the past? So yeah, that's most of the reason why I didn't include much, though I do talk about it a little bit.
You talk about any of the retail, what the retailing business used to be like in downtown Youngstown with the big stores?
I do, and not just downtown, but also in other parts of the city, like the uptown district that used to be there on Market Street. There used to be a lot of, especially, you know, some of the best restaurants probably in the Mahoning Valley were over there. So yeah, I did try to touch on retail too, especially bars, restaurants, things like that. Yeah, because I really wanted to put that in there to give people an idea of, well, you know, here's where people worked, but here's what was also in the community. Here's where people maybe went to the prom. Here's where people went to the movie. Here's where people went to go have a Boilermaker or whatever, to try to give you know, a more complete picture of what the urban environment looked like. Anybody else?
Anything on the roller skating rink?
I touched on it a little bit, not much, but I was very interested in that, and there was a couple of places that I wanted to do more on, but I couldn't really find any good pictures of it. Yeah, because I mean, like dancing was, especially in the 30s and 40s, dancing was like a must. You really needed to know how to dance. But roller skating was kind of big right after that for a long time. I mean, roller skating was, even when I was a kid, it was, people were still, I don't know if kids roller skate anymore now or not. I have no clue. But yeah, roller skating was a big deal. There was an old roller skating rink in Youngstown called, I believe it was called Max for a long period of time, and then it became Reed's Arena, which was a roller skating rink, but then at night Reed's Arena had some of the biggest acts in R&B in the country that would come through there, like James Brown played there and Marvin Gaye and people like that. But this was just an old roller skating rink. And I have a little bit about that in there, but once again, that was a place that I couldn't find enough information on.
Where was Reed's Arena?
At the end, at the very bottom of Oak Hill, there's an old restaurant that used to be, that's still down there. The building is still down there. The name escapes me. Mark, do you know what the restaurant is right down there?
Mr. Anderson?
Yeah, Mr. Anthony's. Right next to Mr. Anthony's.
On the river.
Anthony's on the river, right. That parking lot that's down there, that's where it was.
Okay.
Right down there.
There was a highway arena too. Wasn't it called highway?
It was on 422.
Yeah.
Yeah, there was a couple of different places that had the name arena in them. One of them was down by Midlothian. Yeah, another one was out over here, closer to where the old monkey's nest was. And yeah, and they had things like roller skating and ice skating, and also wrestling was real big. There was a lot of, you know, amateur and pseudo-professional wrestling that used to come in the days before WWF. I don't know if you remember seeing wrestlers around here, but there was a lot of touring wrestling that came through too. That was a big thing to go and see. Yeah, that's probably the most covered thing I can think of.
Probably doing one like that, and
You know, no, and there are still immigrant groups to touch on, but there are a couple of chapters in here, especially the chapter where I talk about the neighborhoods that used to be down off West Federal Street, where I do go into a lot of depth about immigrant groups because there were so many. And there are some books out there. I know there's a book on the Slovak community and the Irish, the Italians.
that might have covered those countries.
I'm trying to...
I know, it's hard to think of it offhand.
Offhand, I can't think of, but there are definitely a lot of books available. And I know a gentleman who is also doing one now, currently right now in the Jewish community. So I think there's going to be a lot more books on that. And I guess I just avoided it because, because of the kind of series that this book is a part of, it's like more about a wider area, not just one group. And also because I just know that there's other authors that are really going to touch on that subject matter. Because as you know, ethnicity is such a big deal in this area, and not in a lot of other areas which are interesting. Like where I grew up in Canton, you might ask someone, well, what's your ethnic background or whatever? I don't know. I'm white, I don't know what to tell you. But here people can tell you. I mean, they might even have traditional ethnic costume, they might know a dance, they might be able to speak part of the language. That fascinated me too, is how still at this late date, how attached a lot of people are to their ethnic heritage, and they can actually tell you something about it, whereas in a lot of different cities, even big cities like Chicago, people don't know anything about their ethnic heritage.
That's what I'm thinking around here. I spent a whole afternoon a couple weeks ago just driving around Briar Hill and just looking at that whole section and just finding things that used to be there.
And the festivals that we still have here too, where they have dancing and traditional foods and things like that. I mean, it still amazes me how many of these festivals are still around.
It runs so deep around here.
Yeah, well, yeah, it just goes to show exactly how deep it does run around here. It's kind of a a unique thing, I think.
Well, I'd just like to say, if we just call it the Mahoning Valley to kind of...
Right.
I don't think we have to take second place to anybody in any respect, based on our history and all these other aspects you're talking about, the ethnicity groups, the cultural traditions, the industrial background, and educational institutions, and all of that. We don't have to take second place to anybody, and I have always felt that way. I've traveled a lot, and I am firmly convinced of that. As far as I'm concerned, we live in the best place in the world.
Yeah, I mean, well, right, and I think this book and a lot of the things I'm talking about are definitely evidence of that. And there's a lot of I think young people who grow up and who don't know anything about this. I'm like, God, I can't wait to go to Atlanta or Charlotte or wherever else and forget this area. There's nothing good could come of it. But I would disagree with that, and I would more tend to agree with what you said. And I think that in the future, this era is also going to have a lot to offer, especially when you think about. I lived in California for a number of years, and there's a almost perpetual water crisis out there, especially in the Southwest. And the way things have been going, that could only get worse. And there's millions of people who sometime, and maybe within my lifetime, might find themselves with nowhere to go except a place like Ohio that still has lots of arable land and lots of water. So, yeah. Just put that in there.
You'll have to put up a wall, huh?
Right, well, what? Well, God, I hope not, but hey, you never know. Right. Trump was ahead of his time and just the wall was in the wrong place, right? Okay. Anybody else? Well, thank you. Oh, no, go ahead. No, go ahead. Thank you.
We had enjoyed a movie called Youngstown Still Standing.
Oh, yeah.
Are you aware of that?
Yeah, no, is that Boom Boom Mancini's movie? Right, yeah.
It didn't go possibly back as far as your book did, but it had a lot of interesting things about the history of the local
Yeah, there was some very interesting, and he was able to get a lot of good historical footage for that too. Yeah, he did a good job of that. And Boom Boom lives in the area again, and he's been a he's been a great defender of the area and a great promoter of the area, which is and I've met him a couple times, and he's a great guy. But yeah, that's a good documentary too. I should have mentioned that. It came out maybe I think 4 or 5 years ago, pretty recently. Yeah. Yeah, Youngstown's still standing. Absolutely. Okay, well, thank you very much.